I was 17 when the Italians came. Before that day, my world was small, a stone village clinging to the mountains, goats on the slopes, and the call to prayer echoing through the valley at dawn. Life was hard, but it was ours. The rhythm of the land, the taste of bread baked in the clay oven, the smell of wood smoke in winter, these were the things I knew. My father, like all men in our village, carried his rifle as naturally as his walking stick. Albania had always lived under someone's shadow. Ottomans, then kings, and now this. But none of us were prepared for what came that April morning in 1939. Word reached us before the sound of their boots. The Italians had landed at Duras, their ships vomiting soldiers and steel. Tirana fell within a day. Our king, Zog, fled across the border with his family, leaving us behind to face the wolves. I remember the silence in our square when the news reached us. Some cursed him, others stared at the mountains, as if the stones themselves might offer guidance. My father spat on the ground and said nothing. That silence frightened me more than words. A week later, the Italians came to our valley. I watched from the ridge as their trucks wound up the road, engines growling, dust rising in clouds. They looked unstoppable. Helmets gleaming, rifles glinting, banners snapping in the wind. Our elders lined the road to greet them, forced smiles on faces carved with age. The Italians handed out bread and leaflets promising brotherhood and prosperity under Rome. The children cheered, not knowing better. But we young men clenched our fists in our pockets. We saw how they looked at our women, how they strutted as if they owned the land beneath their boots. That night, around the fire, I heard my father speak at last. "They think we will bow," he said, staring into the flames. "But we are Albanians. We bow to no one." His voice was steady, but I saw the weariness in his eyes. He had fought in skirmishes before, against Serbs, against Greeks, and he knew the price of defiance. Yet even he could not stand the thought of foreign soldiers in our village square. For months, we lived under the occupiers' gaze. They garrisoned the town, patrolled the roads, took our harvests for their army. Their posters went up on walls, Mussolini's face glaring at us like a curse. They demanded our young men enlist in their militias. Some did, out of fear or hunger. Others vanished into the mountains. Whispers began, names spoken softly, talk of bands forming in the forests. The resistance was only a rumor then, but it carried like smoke on the wind. I remember the first act of defiance I saw. A boy no older than me, Besnik, stood in the square and refused to salute an Italian officer. The soldier struck him with a rifle butt, splitting his lip. Besnik spit blood on the man's boots. For a heartbeat, the whole village held its breath. Then the officer laughed, calling him a dog, and walked away. But we saw something in that blood-stained smile. Something that said we were not broken. In secret, I began to meet with others. Friends from the village, shepherds, even a teacher who had returned from Tirana with fire in his eyes. We gathered in barns, in shadowed courtyards, whispering plans we did not yet know how to carry out. My father pretended not to notice, though once I caught him oiling his old rifle more often than before. Fear was everywhere, but so was pride. I remember one night in June when an old man recited verses about Skanderbeg, the hero who had driven the Ottomans from our mountains centuries before. His voice cracked, but his words lit a fire in us. If Skanderbeg had stood against an empire, why not us against Mussolini's legions? We had no planes, no tanks, but we had the mountains, and the mountains had always been our fortress. The Italians grew harsher as the months dragged on. They arrested men for whispers, beat women for defiance, burned barns when grain went missing. Each cruelty only deepened our hatred. My mother, who once prayed for peace above all else, muttered curses when their patrols passed. Even children learned to hate the sound of Italian boots on cobblestones. By autumn, I knew there was no going back. One evening, as the sun bled red across the peaks, I stood outside our house with my father. He placed his rifle in my hands. The wood was worn smooth by his grip, the barrel scarred from years of use. "You are no longer a boy," he said quietly. "The time has come." I felt the weight of it, heavier than any burden I'd carried before. In that moment, I knew my life as a shepherd, as a son, as a boy of the valley was gone. Ahead lay fire, blood, and shadows, but also purpose. The Italians thought Albania was theirs, but in the mountains, in our hearts, the fire of resistance was already burning. And I, Arben, had just stepped into its flames. By 1941, the air in Albania was thick with whispers. You could hear them in the market stalls, in the fields, in the smoke-filled corners of cafes. Someone's cousin had fled into the mountains. A band had ambushed an Italian patrol near Korça. Leaflets appeared overnight on walls in Tirana, promising that the occupiers would one day fall. The Italians tried to stamp out the talk. They raided houses, dragged men from their beds, demanded names. But whispers are harder to silence than gunfire. Each act of repression only spread them further, until the whole country hummed with quiet defiance. I was 19 then, restless and hungry for action. I spent my days tending goats, my nights meeting with friends in barns and cellars. We passed around leaflets smuggled from Tirana, scribbled notes of names. Men we heard were gathering in the mountains. My father's rifle leaned in the corner, oiled and ready, as if waiting for its summons. The first time I saw true resistance, it was little more than a spark. My friend Besnik, the same boy who had spat blood on an Italian's boots, suggested we strike at a supply wagon passing through the valley. It was reckless, perhaps foolish, but we were young and unafraid of death. We ambushed the wagon on a narrow road, rocks piled high to block its wheels. As the soldiers cursed and tried to move the stones, we rained down rocks and bottles from the ridge. It was chaos, shouting, clattering, the crash of glass. One soldier fired blindly into the trees, but we had already melted into the shadows. We gained nothing but bruises that night, yet in our hearts, we had won. We had struck at the occupier, however small the blow. In the tavern later, whispers spread faster than wine. "Boys from the valley hit the Italians," they said. Faces leaned close, eyes shone with hope. It was not long before we were contacted by men who called themselves Partisans. They were older, hardened, with rifles slung across their shoulders and confidence in their voices. They spoke of organized resistance, of cells forming across the country. Some followed the nationalists, others the communists, but both agreed on one thing: the Italians had to go. I remember the first meeting. We gathered deep in the mountains, the night sky clear and sharp, the fire hidden under a tarp to avoid patrol planes. A man named Luan spoke to us. His voice was quiet, but it carried weight. "This land belongs to us," he said. "Our fathers bled for it. Our children will inherit it. But only if we fight." He laid maps across the ground, showing routes of patrols, supply depots, weak points in Italian lines. It was the first time I saw rebellion, not as a dream, but as a plan. Our tasks at first were simple: carry messages between villages, smuggle food into the mountains, spread word of Italian movements. We were shadows, not soldiers. Yet each mission made us feel more alive than all the years of tending goats. One night, I was sent with Besnik and 2 others to cut telephone lines along the road to Elbasan. My hands shook as I climbed the pole, the wire cold against my fingers. Every creak of wood felt like thunder in the silence. Below, Besnik grinned, whispering, "Faster, or the Italians will come." I nearly fell in my hurry, but the line snapped at last, sagging lifeless in the dark. It was a small victory, but it sang in my chest like a song. The Italians retaliated for every whisper. Villages suspected of sheltering partisans were raided, houses burned, men beaten, women harassed. Once, they hung 2 boys in the square of Shkoda as a warning. I did not see it, but the story traveled like smoke. For a time, fear tightened its grip. Mothers begged their sons to stay home. Fathers hid their rifles under floorboards. But fear does not last forever. Anger grows in its place. In the spring of 1941, as the snows melted, we carried our first rifles into the mountains. Old, rusty, mismatched, some Ottoman relics, some stolen from Italians. But they were ours. I still remember the weight of mine, cold and heavy, resting against my shoulder as I climbed the rocky slopes. We were no longer just boys whispering in barns. We were becoming fighters. That summer, I did not return to the valley. My mother wept when I told her, clutching my face in her hands. My father stood silent, then placed his rough palm on my shoulder. "Do not fight for glory," he said. "Fight for the land, for the people. That is enough." I walked into the mountains with Besnik beside me, the sound of goats fading behind us, replaced by the rustle of pines and the distant howl of wolves. The whispers were over. The fire of rebellion had been lit, and we were stepping into its flames. The mountains became my home in 1942. I had walked their slopes all my life, tending goats, chasing after streams, climbing rocks for the sheer joy of being young. But now I climbed with a rifle on my shoulder and war in my heart. Every ridge became a lookout, every cave a hiding place, every forest a camp. The mountains had always been Albania's fortress, and now they became our barracks. We were 20 men at first, ragged and mismatched. Some wore shepherd's cloaks, others patched uniforms stolen from Italians. Our weapons were as varied as our clothes: old Mausers, Ottoman muskets, captured carcanos, even a few pistols that jammed as often as they fired. But what we lacked in arms, we made up in will. Our camp lay in a pine forest above a rushing stream. Tents of canvas and wool patched with rags clung to the slopes. Smoke from our fires was carefully hidden under branches, rising in thin threads that disappeared into the mountain air. Nights were bitter cold, the wind howling down the valley. But we huddled together for warmth, telling stories until sleep claimed us. Hunger was our constant companion. Bread was hard and thin, beans boiled until tasteless, and meat rare as gold. When we were lucky, villagers risked their lives to bring us cheese, onions, or a skin of reiki. We thanked them with promises of freedom. Sometimes the hunger twisted our guts so badly we could not stand. Yet even then, no one spoke of quitting. To return home meant shame, or worse, betrayal. Despite the hardship, there was laughter. Around the fire, we sang old songs, voices rough but strong. Besnik played his flute, the notes carrying through the night like a prayer. We joked about our ragged clothes, about the lice that tormented us, about the Italians who stumbled in our mountains like lost sheep. Laughter was as much a weapon as our rifles. It kept despair at bay. Our first serious clash came in the spring. An Italian patrol, a dozen men, marched along the valley road with supplies. We had watched them for days from the cliffs above, waiting for the right moment. At dawn, Luan, our leader, gave the signal. The crack of rifles shattered the morning silence. Italians scrambled for cover, shouting in confusion. Bullets sparked off rocks, echoing through the canyon. I remember the recoil of my rifle slamming into my shoulder, the acrid smell of gunpowder filling my lungs, the strange mix of terror and exhilaration. The fight was brief. We struck fast, then melted into the trees before reinforcements could arrive. 2 Italians lay dead, several wounded. We captured rifles, ammunition, and a crate of food. It felt like victory. We laughed as we hauled the spoils back to camp, our hunger forgotten for a night. But the price came swiftly. Days later, Italian trucks rolled into the nearest village. They dragged men into the square, beat them for information, torched a barn. A woman's screams carried through the valley like a knife. We watched from the hills, helpless, fury burning in our chests. That night, no one laughed. Besnik stared into the fire, fists clenched. "For every torch they light," he whispered, "we will light 10 more." The Italians called us bandits, criminals, vermin. Their newspapers claimed Albania was pacified, yet their soldiers feared the shadows of the mountains. Every step along a narrow pass, every rustle in the trees, every glint on a ridge filled them with dread, and we fed on that fear. Summer bled into autumn. More men joined us. Farmers, students, deserters from the Italian ranks. Our numbers grew, so did our losses. I carried wounded comrades on my back, watched boys younger than me bleed into the dirt. Each face I buried carved itself into my soul, yet each death steeled my resolve. We were no longer boys playing at rebellion. We were partisans, and this was war. Life in the mountains forged bonds stronger than blood. We became brothers, sharing hunger, fire, and fear. I trusted Besnik with my life, and he trusted me. In the dark, when despair whispered, it was his laughter that pulled me back. In battle, when bullets cracked, it was his voice shouting beside me that steadied my hands. In that brotherhood, I found strength I never knew I had. Still, I longed for home. At night, I dreamed of my mother's bread, of my father's steady voice, of the valley bathed in morning light. But when I woke, the mountains loomed, cold and eternal. Home had become a memory, distant and unreachable. By winter's first snow, the Italians had learned to fear us. We struck at night, vanishing before dawn. We cut their lines, ambushed their convoys, harassed their garrisons until sleep eluded them. They outnumbered us, outgunned us, but we had the mountains, and the mountains were ours. In those days, we believed we could drive them out with rifles, courage, and the will of a free people. We did not yet know how much blood the earth would demand in payment. The war turned red in the summer of 1942. By then, our band had grown bold. We ambushed Italian patrols, blew up supply wagons, cut their lines again and again. Each strike made us stronger, more rifles, more recruits, more courage. But with every attack, the enemy's reprisals grew harsher. And when fire came, it came not for us in the mountains, but for those we had left behind. It happened in July. We struck at a convoy, winding through the valley, below our camp. 20 trucks filled with fuel and munitions. We hit them at dusk, rifles cracking from the cliffs, grenades rolling under wheels. Flames roared as a truck exploded, the blast shaking the earth beneath our feet. Italians screamed, their shouts lost in the thunder of fire. We slipped away before reinforcements arrived, triumphant, laughing at our daring. 2 days later, smoke rose from the valley, not from trucks, but from homes. The Italians had marched into my village. From the ridge, I watched helplessly as they dragged men into the square, forcing them to kneel. Women clutched their children, screaming as barns were set ablaze. Flames leapt into the sky, black smoke twisting like a curse. Soldiers kicked down doors, looted what they could, torched what they could not carry. I saw my neighbor, old Petrit, struck down with a rifle butt when he tried to shield his granddaughter. She screamed until her voice broke. We could do nothing. Luan, our leader, held us back with a voice hard as steel. They want us to charge. They want to lure us down into the open. If we go, we die, and the village burns anyway. His words cut like knives. My hands shook on my rifle, tears blurring my sight. Besnik cursed under his breath, punching the ground until his knuckles bled. When the Italians finally left, the village lay in ashes. Fields trampled, barns smoldering, houses gutted. I walked through the ruins in silence, the smell of smoke and flesh choking the air. My mother's house still stood, barely. Inside, she sat on the floor, clutching my younger sister to her chest. Her eyes met mine, relief, sorrow, and a question she did not need to speak. Was it worth it? That night, I could not sleep. The laughter of our ambush echoed in my ears, twisted now into something hollow. We had struck a blow, yes, but the price had been paid in fire and blood by those who had no rifles, no mountains to hide in. The guilt settled heavy in my chest, yet so did the fury. I swore to myself that the occupier would pay for every barn, every tear, every drop of blood they spilled. Our strikes grew harsher after that. We no longer targeted just patrols. We hit their outposts, their garrisons, their collaborators. We became wolves, descending from the mountains at night with teeth bared, vanishing before dawn. We left messages carved into trees, painted on walls. For every house you burn, we will strike 10 of yours. But vengeance brought its own price. The Italians tightened their grip. Checkpoints sprouted along roads, curfews strangled towns, and suspicion poisoned the air. In some villages, fear turned to betrayal. Informants whispered names to the occupiers, and men vanished in the night. When one of our own was captured, he was paraded through the streets before being shot in the square. His body was left hanging for days as a warning. I forced myself to look when we passed through. His eyes were gone, but his mouth still seemed to whisper, "Do not stop." In those months, I felt myself harden. The boy who had once chased goats through the valleys was gone. I moved like a shadow, slept with my rifle, ate with my hand always on steel. My hands shook less when I pulled the trigger. My laughter, when it came, was sharper, edged with something bitter. Even Besnik, once so quick with jokes, grew quiet. His flute lay untouched, gathering dust in his pack. Still, there were sparks of humanity that refused to die. Villagers risked everything to feed us, slipping bread and cheese into our hands with trembling smiles. Children ran to meet us, eyes shining with pride, as if we were heroes and not outlaws. One old woman, her house reduced to ash, pressed a hand to my cheek and whispered, "Fight, my son. Fight so they will not suffer, as I have her touch burned hotter than any fire." By autumn, the mountains were alive with partisans. Across Albania, bands like ours struck, bled, and endured. The Italians grew desperate, their uniforms stained with smoke, their faces drawn with fear. We had no tanks, no planes, no artillery, only rifles, courage, and the will of a people who refused to kneel. But courage could not shield the villages forever. Each victory carried a shadow, each ambush a price. We were learning the truth of war, that freedom demands sacrifice, and that sometimes the innocent pay it first. That autumn, I stood on a ridge, rifle across my chest, watching smoke rise once again from the valley. My heart burned with fury, but also with doubt. How much more could our people endure? How many more barns, how many more graves, before the occupiers' grip loosened? The fire of rebellion had been lit, but now it threatened to consume us all. The world shifted in the autumn of 1943. We had fought the Italians for years, ragged ambushes, burning convoys, reprisals paid for in blood. They had been cruel, yes, but they were also weary. Their soldiers far from home, their hearts not in the mountains of Albania. Then came the news. Italy had surrendered. Mussolini's banners were torn down in Rome, and Italian soldiers laid down their arms. At first, we celebrated. Villages rang with songs, children danced in the squares, old men toasted freedom with reiki. For a brief, fragile moment, we believed the war was over for us. I remember sitting by the fire with Besnik, grinning like boys again, daring to dream of returning home. Perhaps we will see peace before the snows, he said, eyes alight with hope. But hope is a cruel liar. Within weeks, the Germans marched in. They came with discipline and fire, their boots heavier, their rifles sharper, their eyes colder. Where Italians had swaggered, Germans stalked. Where Italians had punished, Germans exterminated. We called them hyenas, because they devoured everything in their path. They wasted no time. Entire villages were surrounded, men herded into fields, women locked in barns. Anyone suspected of aiding us was shot on sight. They did not burn houses to frighten. They burned them to erase. Stone by stone, roof by roof, they crushed the spirit of the valleys. We learned quickly that the Germans were not the same enemy. Their patrols were precise, their ambushes traps for us rather than the other way around. Once, we struck at a column near Elbasan, expecting them to scatter like Italians had. Instead, they wheeled their machine guns with mechanical precision, pinning us against the rocks. Only night saved us, and even then, we crawled through the mud like rats, leaving 2 brothers behind in the dark. The mountains shielded us, but even the mountains trembled under their fury. They brought artillery into the valleys, pounding ridges where they thought we hid. Trees splintered, rocks shattered, the very earth groaned. For the first time, I feared the mountains would not be enough. Worse still, divisions grew among us. With Italy gone, nationalist and communist factions of the resistance turned their knives toward one another, each claiming to be the true guardians of Albania's future. Meetings that once rang with unity now bristled with suspicion. I remember standing in a ruined farmhouse as 2 commanders shouted across the table, spittle flying, fists pounding. "The Germans are the enemy," Luan snapped, "not each other." But his voice, strong as it was, could not drown the murmurs of mistrust. Still, we fought. We had no choice. In September, our unit sabotaged a railway line near Pogradec. We worked through the night, hands numb, sweat freezing on our backs. When the train came, a long serpent of steel carrying fuel and munitions, we held our breath. The explosion lit the sky like dawn, flames roaring into the heavens. For a moment, we felt invincible. But vengeance followed swiftly. The Germans executed 20 villagers the next morning, their bodies left by the tracks as a warning. I saw them when we returned to survey the damage. Old men, young boys, even a priest among them. Their eyes stared at the sky, lifeless, accusing. My stomach twisted, bile rising in my throat. Besnik fell to his knees, fists pressed to his forehead, whispering prayers that sounded more like curses. That night, we buried them in silence, our shovels striking the earth like drums of mourning. It was then I realized the Germans did not just fight us with bullets and fire. They fought us with despair. Every reprisal, every corpse, was meant to break the bond between partisans and villagers. They wanted mothers to curse us, fathers to drive us away, children to fear us. And sometimes it worked. I saw doors close when we passed, eyes avert, whispers accuse. The enemy had turned our people into our battlefield. Yet still, others gave everything to aid us. Women smuggled bread under their shawls. Boys ran as couriers through the forests. Priests hid rifles beneath their altars. In their courage, we found strength. They bore the German shadow with us, and because of them, we endured. By winter, the snow returned, blanketing the mountains in silence. The Germans did not leave, as the Italians sometimes had. They dug in. Checkpoints multiplied, garrisons swelled, and still we struck when we could. The war had grown darker, colder, heavier. The laughter around our fires faded, replaced by grim silence and hollow eyes. One night, as snowflakes drifted against the flames, Besnik leaned close. "Do you ever wonder if we will live to see freedom?" he asked. His voice trembled, though his face was hard. I stared into the fire, the smoke stinging my eyes. "If not us," I said, "then those who come after. But someone must fight, or Albania will die." He nodded, though the sorrow in his gaze never lifted. The Italian years had been a game of ambush and reprisal. The German years were survival itself. We no longer dreamed of victory. We only dreamed of lasting long enough for dawn to come. And in the shadow of the swastika, dawn felt very far away. Night became our ally. The Germans owned the roads by day, their convoys grinding through valleys, their boots stamping in the towns. But when the sun dipped behind the mountains, the shadows belonged to us. We were the wolves of the night, and we hunted when their eyes were heavy with sleep. Our missions were born in whispers around the fire, maps drawn in ash on the dirt. A bridge here, a railway there, a patrol ambushed on a lonely road. Small strikes, never meant to win the war, but to remind the occupiers that Albania was not theirs. I remember one night in early 1944. We crept through the pines above a pass near Korça, moonlight painting the rocks silver. Below us, a German column wound its way along the road, trucks heavy with munitions, their headlights stabbing at the dark. Luan raised his hand. We waited, hearts hammering, rifles slick with sweat despite the cold. When he dropped it, the mountains erupted. Grenades thundered, rifles cracked. Flames leapt as a truck exploded, sending shards of metal into the sky. The Germans scrambled, shouting orders, but confusion ruled. We fired, fell back, fired again, then vanished into the trees before they could rally. Behind us, the road glowed with burning wrecks, smoke rising like a black scar against the stars. We did not linger to count the dead. In guerrilla war, you strike and disappear. To stay is to die. We ran through the night, boots pounding the earth, lungs burning. Only when the first light crept over the peaks did we rest, collapsing among the roots of ancient pines, laughter bubbling through our exhaustion. For a moment, we felt immortal. But the Germans were not fools. They learned. Their patrols moved with greater caution, their reprisals sharper. After one railway attack near Škoda, they rounded up an entire village, shooting 5 men in the square and deporting the rest. We returned to find the place silent, the houses locked, the wells dry. It was as if life itself had fled. The guilt gnawed at me in the dark hours. I told myself the fight was necessary, that freedom demanded sacrifice, but the faces of those villagers haunted me. Besnik confessed the same torment. "Do you ever wonder," he whispered one night as we lay under the stars, "if we bring more death than the Germans themselves?" His words hung heavy between us, unanswerable. Yet the next day, he picked up his rifle as always. What else was there to do? Life in the mountains hardened us. Hunger never left. We chewed bark to silence our stomachs, drank from streams fouled with mud, lived on crusts of bread smuggled by villagers who risked everything. Winter nights froze our bones. Our boots wore thin, our cloaks stiff with frost. Yet we endured. We had no choice. Sometimes there was light amid the darkness. I remember a wedding, 2 partisans who had fallen in love during the long marches. We gathered in a ruined chapel, the roof open to the stars, rifles stacked at the door. A priest whispered the vows, his voice trembling, and we cheered as if the world were not on fire. For a night, we danced, sang, and forgot the war. Hope flickered like a candle, fragile but alive. Still, death was never far. One night, on a raid near Berat, we lost our dit, a boy of 16. A German bullet caught him as we retreated. He fell without a sound, his rifle clattering against the stones. We could not stop to carry him. The enemy was too close. Only later, when the mountains swallowed us, did Besnik collapse, sobbing into his hands. "He was just a child," he choked. But in war, children became soldiers, and soldiers became corpses. The Germans called us bandits, but we knew the truth. We were partisans, fighting with shadows, knives, and courage. Every bridge we blew, every patrol we harassed, every convoy we burned, it was proof that Albania was not conquered. We could not defeat the Reich, not alone, but we could bleed it. And bleed it we did, drop by drop, night by night. By the spring of 1944, the mountains echoed with gunfire, the valleys choked with smoke. Our ranks swelled with men and women from every corner of Albania. Farmers, teachers, shepherds, even priests took up arms. The Germans grew desperate, their iron grip tightening. But the harder they squeezed, the more we slipped through their fingers. I still remember one dawn after a raid, standing on a ridge as the sun broke over the peaks. The valley below was quiet, the smoke of burning trucks curling into the morning air. My rifle was heavy in my hands, my body exhausted, my heart numb. And yet, watching the light spill across the land, I felt something stir. The Germans had shadows, but we had the mountains, and the mountains endured. It was not always the Germans we feared. By 1944, our greatest enemy sometimes wore the face of a brother. When the Italians fled and the Germans came, we partisans had been united by survival. But as the war dragged on, whispers turned inward. The communists, led by Enver Hoxha, spoke of a new Albania, red, disciplined, uncompromising. The nationalists, many of them Bali Kombatar, dreamed of an independent Albania ruled by patriots, not ideology. Both fought the Germans, yes, but both also eyed the future, and the future was worth killing for. At first, the disputes were words, harsh meetings in smoky barns, arguments over supplies, over who commanded raids, over whose flag flew above liberated villages. I stood in one such meeting, my rifle across my knees, as voices rose like thunder. One man slammed his fist on the table. "You fight for Moscow," he spat at the communists. The reply came swift, "And you fight for kings and landlords." Luan, our leader, tried to quiet them. "The Germans still march in our valleys," he said. "Do you think they care whether your rifles are red or black? Fight them first. Argue later." His words cut sharp, but his voice carried less weight than before. The seed of betrayal was already growing. The first time I saw it bloom was in a village near Gjirokastër. We arrived after a raid, hoping to rest, only to find the place split in two. Half the men wore the red scarf of the communists. The other half carried the eagle flag of the nationalists. They had been comrades days before. Now they glared at one another as if enemies. That night, shots cracked in the square. By dawn, 2 men lay dead. Not Germans, but Albanians. We buried them in silence. I stared at their graves and felt the ground shift beneath me. The Germans had not fired those bullets. We had. The distrust crept into our own ranks. Men I had shared bread with now questioned my loyalties. "Where does Luan stand?" they whispered. "Will he follow the communists or side with the Borli?" Even Besnik, my brother in arms, grew restless. "What if we fight the wrong war?" he asked one night as we cleaned our rifles. His eyes were shadowed, his voice tight. I had no answer. Betrayal came not just in words, but in blood. One evening, we marched to meet a supposed Allied band for a joint ambush. Instead, we walked into an empty field, the Germans waiting on the ridge. Bullets raked the earth. Men screamed, diving for cover. I fired blindly, the world a blur of dust and gunfire. When we finally escaped into the trees, half our number were gone. Later, we learned the truth. Someone had betrayed our position, not to the Germans, but to a rival Albanian group eager to see us destroyed. Rage boiled in our chests, hotter than any hatred of the occupiers. "We bleed for Albania," Besnik spat, "and Albanians spill our blood." The Germans took advantage, of course. They tightened their grip while we argued in barns and ambushed one another in the dark. They laughed at our divisions, even as we picked off their convoys. I could almost hear their officers saying, "Let the Albanians kill themselves. It saves us bullets." Still, not all was lost. Many partisans clung to unity, refusing to let politics break their bond. Luan was one of them. "We fight for the land," he reminded us. "Not for red, not for black. Albania will outlive us all." His voice steadied me, even as the world crumbled. Without him, I think I might have walked away, back to my valley, back to nothing. But betrayal left scars deeper than bullets. I saw men refuse to share bread with their comrades. I heard curses muttered in the dark, knives drawn not for Germans but for Albanians. Once, I stopped Besnik from lunging at a fellow partisan after an argument over orders. His face was twisted with rage I barely recognized. The mountains no longer felt safe. Shadows lurked not just with enemy patrols, but with suspicion. Every whisper carried weight. Every fire burned with mistrust. And yet, the fight went on. Germans still marched, convoys still rolled, villages still wept. We still struck, still bled, still buried our dead beneath cold stones. But I felt the war shift. It was no longer just freedom we fought for. It was the shape of what freedom would mean. That summer, I stood on a ridge and watched 2 bands of partisans clash in the valley below. Albanian against Albanian, rifles cracking, smoke rising. My stomach twisted as I gripped my rifle. "Is this what we've become?" I asked Luan, who stood beside me. His face was lined, his eyes heavy. "This is the curse of war," he said quietly. "It teaches us to hate, even when the enemy wears our own face." I turned away, the sound of gunfire echoing in my ears. The Germans were still our occupiers, but the greatest wound now was self-inflicted. Betrayal had entered the mountains, and it would never truly leave. By 1944, the Germans had learned our patterns. Every time we struck, they struck back. Harder, colder, more merciless than before. If we burned one truck, they burned a village. If we killed a patrol, they executed a dozen civilians. The war had become a firestorm, and it was our people who burned. I remember the day the flames came to my valley. We had ambushed a German convoy near Elbasan, blowing the lead truck with a mine. The blast hurled men and steel into the sky, the road a crater of smoke and fire. We struck fast, rifles spitting, grenades rolling, then melted into the trees. It was a clean victory. Not one of us was lost. We celebrated around the fire that night, toasting with stolen schnapps, laughing louder than we should have. The laughter died at dawn. Smoke rose from the valley below, thick, black, choking. We rushed to the ridge and stared in horror. The Germans had descended on my village. Trucks circled the square, soldiers swarming like ants. Barns blazed, roofs collapsed. The cries of women and children carried on the wind. My knees went weak as I recognized my own home among the burning. I ran. No command, no plan, no thought. Just the desperate instinct of a son. Besnik chased after me, shouting, but I barely heard. By the time we reached the valley, it was too late. The Germans were gone, leaving only fire and ash in their wake. The square was a charnel house. Men I had known all my life lay scattered, their faces twisted in death. Women clutched lifeless children in their arms, their screams ragged and hollow. My own house was nothing but blackened stone. Inside the ruins, I found my sister's scarf, charred at the edges, clutched in the soot like a ghost of her. My mother was nowhere. My father had been taken weeks before, vanished in the night, and now she too was gone. I do not remember how long I stood there, the scarf pressed to my chest. The world spun, the fire roared, but inside me there was only silence. When Besnik found me, his eyes were wet, but his voice was steady. "They want you to break," he said. "Do not give them what they want." I nodded, though I felt nothing but emptiness. That night, we buried the dead in shallow graves. We had no coffins, no priests, only shovels and tears. As I laid the scarf into the earth with the others, a vow burned in me. No reprisal, no massacre, no sea of German blood could ever bring them back. But I swore I would not rest until I had made the occupiers feel the same fire they had brought to my people. The reprisals grew worse as the year dragged on. Entire villages were wiped from the map. Men hanged in rows, their bodies swaying in the wind. Women dragged away in trucks, never to return. Children shot for carrying bread to the mountains. The Germans had no mercy, no restraint. They wanted not just to crush us, but to erase us. We fought harder. Sabotage became our lifeline. We blew railways, cut telegraph lines, burned fuel depots. Each strike cost them dearly, but each strike brought vengeance down on innocents. It was a cycle without end. Fire answered by fire, blood by blood. I began to wonder if Albania itself could survive it. The worst came in September. We attacked a garrison near Tirana, overrunning it in the night, seizing rifles and ammunition. It was a triumph. But the Germans retaliated with a ferocity beyond anything we had seen. They rounded up 3 villages, hundreds of people, and drove them into the fields. Machine guns spat until silence fell. When we arrived, the earth was carpeted with bodies. Mothers, children, old men, all gone. Besnik fell to his knees, pounding the ground with his fists. Luan stood rigid, his face pale as stone. I felt myself split in two, half raging, half hollow, torn between the urge to scream and the weight of despair. That night, around the fire, Luan spoke with a voice I had never heard before. "They will break us all if we fight alone," he said. "But word has come, the Allies are advancing. The Germans are retreating everywhere. If we endure a little longer, their time will end. Endure. That word became our prayer. We no longer dreamed of victory. We dreamed of survival, of lasting one more night, one more raid, one more winter. We told ourselves that if Albania was burning, it was only so the fire of freedom could rise from the ashes. But as I stared into the flames, the scarf of my sister folded in my pack, I wondered how much of Albania would be left to save. The Germans thought their fire could erase us, but all it did was burn away the boy I had been. What remained was a man carved from loss, hardened by grief and sharpened by vengeance. I was no longer fighting for freedom. I was fighting because I had nothing left to lose. By the autumn of 1944, the shadow began to lift. News spread like fire carried by the wind. The Allies had landed in Normandy. The Soviets were storming through the east, and the Reich was bleeding on every front. In the mountains of Albania, we felt the tremor of their collapse. German convoys grew smaller, their patrols thinner, their arrogance dulled by fear. For the first time in years, hope whispered louder than despair, but the dying beast still had claws. In October, we struck at a German column retreating through the Shkumbin Valley. Trucks laden with supplies and stolen treasure groaned along the road, their guards weary but still deadly. We had waited in silence all day, crouched in the wet leaves, rifles steady, hearts pounding. When the signal came, the mountains erupted. Explosives tore through the lead truck, a fireball lighting the twilight. Rifles barked, grenades thundered, shouts rang out. The Germans scrambled, returning fire, but they were cornered. We rained death upon them, moving like ghosts from rock to rock. The fight lasted minutes, but it felt like an eternity. When the smoke cleared, the valley floor was littered with bodies, steel, and flames. We seized rifles, boots, even canned food. It was victory, not just in battle, but in spirit. That night, around the fire, men sang again. Voices cracked, roughened by years of hunger and grief. But they sang of freedom, of eagles soaring over Albania, of a land that would be ours again. I had not heard such songs since before the Italians came. My chest ached with something I had nearly forgotten: joy. But liberation did not come without more blood. The Germans, retreating, left only destruction behind. Bridges blown, roads cratered, fields salted with mines. Villages that had survived years of fire now lay in ruins, blackened husks against the mountains. Every step forward was bought with danger. One night, we marched into a village near Berat, expecting to find comrades. Instead, we found silence. Doors hung open, animals wandered untended. The square was empty. In the center, a single body hung from a beam, a partisan strung up as a warning. His face was swollen, unrecognizable, but his scarf told us who he was. A chill ran through our band. The Germans were leaving, yes, but they were leaving ghosts behind. Still, we pressed on. By November, our numbers swelled. Farmers left their plows. Students left their books. Even women joined us, rifles slung over thin shoulders. Albania rose like a storm. The Germans could not hold back the tide. They were hunted from pass to pass, ambushed on every road, harassed in every valley. Each day brought news of another retreat, another stronghold falling to our hands. The final push came in Tirana. For days, we fought in the streets, rifles cracking from windows, grenades bursting in alleys. Smoke choked the air, buildings crumbled, cries echoed through the city. The Germans clung to every corner, but we drove them out block by block, step by bloody step. I fought beside Besnik, the two of us moving as one, our boots slick with mud and blood. On November 17th, 1944, Tirana was free. I remember standing in Skanderbeg Square, the sun breaking through smoke as our flag rose above the city. The black double-headed eagle, fierce and proud, unfurled against the sky. Tears blurred my vision, my rifle heavy in my hands. Around me, men and women cheered, their voices hoarse but triumphant. For the first time since I was a boy, I felt Albania breathe again. But victory was not joy alone. The square was also filled with the dead. Comrades lay still where they had fallen, their blood soaking into the cobblestones. Mothers wept, fathers embraced sons who would never grow old. Liberation had come, but its price was written in every tear, every grave, every ruin. That night, we celebrated, but it was a hollow feast. Bread shared with trembling hands, reiki swallowed like medicine, laughter forced through cracked lips. We had won, yes, but the shadows of the fallen sat beside us. Besnik raised his cup, his voice steady. To Albania, he said, to those who lived and to those who never will. We drank in silence, the fire crackling between us. I looked at him, at the faces of my brothers, and I knew we had endured something no one else could ever understand. By winter's first snow, the last Germans fled our land. The mountains echoed with silence once more, broken only by the wind. For the first time in years, the boots of occupiers no longer stamped our valleys. Albania was free. When the last Germans fled, we thought dawn had come. It was November 1944 when Tirana fell, and by the winter snows, all of Albania was ours again. No more swastikas over our towns. No more convoys rumbling through our valleys. No more fire consuming our homes. For the first time in 5 long years, we breathed the air of freedom. Yet freedom did not taste as sweet as I had once imagined. I returned to my valley in the spring of 1945. The path I had known as a boy was scarred by craters, its stones blackened with soot. The fields where I had herded goats lay barren, salted by retreating Germans. My village was a skeleton. Walls collapsed, roofs caved in, the laughter of children replaced by silence. I walked among the ruins, rifles slung across my back, boots crunching on ash. My house was gone, only charred stones and memories remained. I found no trace of my mother, no sign of my sister. Their fate was a shadow I could not lift. In the square, the well still stood, but its water tasted of smoke and sorrow. The neighbors who remained embraced me, their eyes hollow, their smiles weary. They spoke of hunger, of loss, of the dead buried in shallow graves. They called me a hero, but I felt like a ghost among them. What kind of hero returns with nothing but ashes in his hands? Besnik walked at my side, his face older than his years. He had survived every battle with me, yet his laughter was gone. He carried a scar across his cheek, a line of red carved by German steel. We won, he said one evening, as we sat among the ruins. His voice was flat, but what did we win? I had no answer. Albania was free of Germans, yes, but not free of struggle. The factions that had fought side by side now turned their gaze on one another. Communists declared themselves the true voice of the people. Nationalists swore they would not yield. Old arguments flared, sharper now in the vacuum of victory. Some spoke of betrayal, others of vengeance. Whispers carried of arrests, of executions, of purges beginning even before the smoke of war had cleared. I saw it in my own band. Comrades who had fought together now eyed each other with suspicion. Questions about politics replaced songs of freedom. Luan, once our steady guide, grew weary, his voice edged with bitterness. "We survived the Germans," he said to me one night, "but can we survive ourselves?" Still, there were moments of hope. In Tirana, the eagle flag flew proudly. No foreign banner above it, Villages began to rebuild, stones stacked once more into walls, seeds planted in the blackened soil. Children laughed again, though their laughter was thin, fragile. The mountains, scarred by fire, still stood tall against the sky. I tried to find peace in small things. The taste of fresh bread from a neighbor's oven, the sound of a stream rushing through the valley, washing away ash, the sight of Besnik carving a flute from wood, though he rarely played it. Life was returning, slowly, like grass pushing through burned earth. But inside me, the war lingered. At night, I dreamed of ambushes, of gunfire echoing in the cliffs, of villages burning. I woke with sweat on my skin, the smell of smoke in my nose. Sometimes I thought I heard my sister's voice calling, only to find the valley silent. We had fought for freedom, but freedom had come at a price written in blood. A generation of Albanians lay in graves, their names carved into stones or lost to the earth. Families shattered, villages erased, childhoods burned away. We had endured, but at what cost? One evening, as the sun sank behind the peaks, I stood on the ridge above my village. The sky blazed with red and gold, the mountains dark silhouettes against the light. I thought of those who had fallen, Arben, so young, cut down in the dark. Luan, weary but unbroken. My mother and sister, their fate unknown. I whispered their names into the wind, as if the mountains might carry them to wherever the dead rest. Besnik joined me, his flute in his hands. He played at last, a soft, broken melody that drifted into the night. It was not a song of victory, nor of sorrow, but something in between, a song of survival. I closed my eyes and let it carry me, the sound weaving with the wind, with the memories, with the ghosts that would never leave us. When the last note faded, I opened my eyes. The valley lay below, scarred but alive. The mountains towered above, eternal, indifferent. And in my heart, I knew the truth. Albania had survived. We had survived. But dawn, when it came, was not bright and golden. It was bitter, grey with ash and shadows. We had won our freedom, but peace was still far away. I tightened my grip on my rifle, even as I wished to lay it down. The war was over. Yet for men like me, the war would never truly end.